Roseanne's.
No, I'm not.
Oh, is Keith on the? Is it Skype or just?
It's Skype.
Oh, okay.
He's all
Hello, Keith.
squared away. Could you hear? Oh, good. Did you hear Keith? He said hello.
Yes, I did. Roseanne has a 30-minute presentation, so that's about the limit of the public presentation. So maybe we would have time for 2 or 3 questions, but not a whole lot. And the only other thing that I want to say, except welcome, is that there's no minimum for a dissertation oral, but it can't go over 2 hours. So with that.
I just want to thank my committee, Larissa, Ken, John, and Keith on Skype for all your work during these 7 years. It's a long time. It's a long time. Whew. And for everyone who came, oh my gosh, thank you. Thank you. People who've known me from my first year, people who are in my class with me, and other people who I've made friends with along the way, and feel very happy to be back here. And so far, my school partner. You get a special shout out. Okay, so let's do it. If you put your ear to my work and you strain to listen, I think you will hear Whisker Street in New Haven on summer nights during the Festa di San Andre. And you hear my Auntie laughing as she made a pot of sauce, and the clanking of the sewing machine in my nanny's apartment. And you probably hear the tensions between the language of the academy and the one spoken at home. And you maybe hear some questioning as to the value of Western and rhetorical literary tradition, and also skepticism toward the narratives of advancement that circulate around literary practices. And you certainly hear a lament, a longing for the people and the places and the things that one becomes uprooted from. Sometimes when he or she starts to walk down the road to Parnassus and tore away from Worcester Street. And it's no surprise to me that I would find Jim W. Porter's work
You got this, Roseanne.
Okay. Oh my God! I wish I was a
Only an hour and 55 more minutes.
Okay, now I would find
Jim Porter has that effect on a lot of us.
I know, but I would find his work so engaging, and because he too felt displaced from his roots, and so thus works to create a theory of rhetorical ethos that allows him to trace them. And I draw upon his works in my dissertation, published and unpublished, as a case study, because Porter shows readers how a writer can understand the term ethos beyond a stylistic interpretation. He values bringing the personal discussion of his objects and places in West Texas into his writing because he believes communicating identity is a part of ethos. So engaging Porter as a theorist rather than as a historical figure in rhetoric and composition, I take his work and I use it to clarify and complicate important elements of rhetorical theory. And I believe my work particularly contributes to the subfield of material rhetoric and place-based composition. So I want to step back from my discussion of Porter to highlight the larger purpose of my research, which is to expand the term ethos beyond the textual, beyond a constructed appeal with words, and into a theory of identity construction that helps us understand rhetorical identification. And I want to understand basically how our living, our things, our places help us construct and also somehow reflect our characters. So this work is informed by rhetorical theory, particularly seeing ethos as an appeal in classical rhetoric, its revival in the 20th century new rhetorics, and its continued study as habitual and emerging in objects and places in the 21st century. So we continue to ask how our worlds create our values and ourselves, and then further, how we communicate this process of world making to others, and then even further, how others identify with our ways of being so that they feel, as Burke describes, consubstantial with us. So I don't have space to reproduce my complete review of the term ethos here, but I want to communicate that I see it as having multiple meanings. Ethos as lived experience, as embodied, ethos as expressed in text, and ethos as expressed through the material, through place and objects. All these threads of ethos matter and play an important role in rhetoric, particularly in practices of identification. So if I can venture to summarize the overarching argument in my dissertation, it's that the ethos appeal, at once textual and beyond textual, expands space and time to create the conditions for identifications that both value and recognize diversity. But ethos is a complex term. Even in ancient discourses, philosophers argue whether character exists as something constructed or revealed, whether it is intrinsic to the soul or wholly of the text. Is ethos to be seen as an appearance the speaker creates, as Aristotle asserts, or is it to be seen as something that precedes speaking, a possession of the speaker that he or she brings to light in truthful discourse, as Plato and Isocrates contend? Of course, these questions are superseded kind of in our contemporary time by the postmodern question, like those posed by Barthes and Foucault, of whether or not our words are even our own, and if we are indeed the authors of our discourses and ourselves. Now, many scholars have spoken to the potential for the ethos appeal to exist beyond an Aristotelian notion of textuality. Michael Holleran connects ethos to cultural knowledge as the speaker is a kind of living embodiment of his or her heritage. Though this definition explicitly links the ethos appeal to place and time and living. This perspective helps us see rhetoric beyond an ability to persuade and more as connected to a way of life, a being. So rhetoric exists beyond the discourse to the world where we feel, move, and interact with people, places, and things. Furthermore, the ethos appeal has the potential to create a threshold or passage into the world of the speaker that is open and inviting. So rhetoric is no longer an abstraction whereby speakers gain assent to an idea, but it's about creating a shared reality with the audience. This broad understanding of rhetoric means that any character or credibility shown through the ethos appeal emerges from, as Thomas Rickert describes, quote, a way of life that is already embedded within locations, communities, societies, and environments, and hence spoken by them as we create and transform them. So if rhetoric creates a gathering place, then it is dependent upon our dwelling. The culture, the landscape, our objects, all must be involved in the emergence and origin of ethos. Michael Hyde suggests that ethos as a rhetorical appeal allows speakers and listeners to, quote, transform space and time into dwelling places where people can deliberate about and know together some matter of interest. The transformative potential of ethos, its ability to hold open space and time to create a world where identification can occur, is a subject that needs further attention, particularly more concrete descriptions as to how this actually happens. And so I keep returning to these questions in my research. Why do we listen to some voices and not to others? How do we explain identification in more concrete ways? What are the conditions in space-time that allow for identification? How does rhetorical ethos relate to moments of identification? So my project relies on seeing language in both literal and abstract ways, in that it both reflects our material reality and yet also disrupts those realities and invites us into imagined worlds. So identification, in fact, requires imaginative leaps in space-time. Heidegger speaks to how language can bridge the difference in space-time through its calling and gathering function. An imaginative leap, he explains, is created through the reading of a poem by George Trakl called A Winter's Evening. He writes, Snowfall and tolling of the vesper bell are spoken to us here and now in this poem. They are present in the call, yet they in no way fall among the things present here and now in this lecture hall. Which presence is higher, that of these present things or the presence of what is called? So this question brings to the forefront an orientation toward the world that asks one to see beyond the potentiality of current space-time. It additionally reminds us of the functions of language that report and reflect material reality and those that move us beyond that reality. How I want to understand identification is through the idea of the call of language. This call is one we must ever attune ourselves to. It requires an open, listening stance. The house of being is a call that gathers, sometimes invites, sometimes commands, us and the world and things into the simple one-fold of their intimacy, according to Heidegger. So I'm interested further in this metaphor of the fold, the gathering of the subject-object. When Burke discusses identification in Rhetoric of Motives, he writes that the relationship between subject and object, and he upholds through his description both a notion of deconstructing and upholding a separation. So he writes, quote, "In being identified with B, A is substantially one with a person other than himself. Yet at the same time, he remains a unique and individual locus of motives. Thus he is joined and separate, at once a distant substance and consubstantial with the other." So this condition of being joined and yet separate is one that continues to engage my imagination. In my inquiry on identification, I found that in order to say anything meaningful about these phenomena about identifications, one has to accept, reject, or continue to wrestle with a notion of subjectivity and its attendant implications for unification. So I'll show my hand and say that I prefer to wrestle with the concept of subject-object relations. When I consider this act of holding the middle ground, I'm reminded of Josh Gunn's assertion that rhetoric is the promise of a coming relatability that never arrives. The notion of the promise is essential here. It implies an everlasting effort to reach toward the other despite the impossibility of being one with the other. So a stance of openness is essential in wrestling with subject-object relations, and theories of language and rhetoric that value this stance, and we can name many that do: Porter's emergence, Burke's identification, Foss and Griffin's invitational rhetoric, Hooke's radical openness, Lohonis's world traveling, Young's Rogerian rhetoric. Even though these theories are really contrasting and different in some ways, they move forward this important discussion on potentialities of rhetorical identifications that recognize rhetoric as a promise of relatability. An essential commonality is that they support the continuous production of language through dialogue. An open stance, too, creates a space where multiple meanings exist, and this ambiguity in meaning creates a type of spaciousness that ideally allows for a valuing of multiple subjectivities without the erasure of selves. So in other words, when one practices a theory of rhetoric that values an open stance, perhaps subject-object relations become subject-subject relations. A shift occurs in terms of how we perceive the other, not as completely ourselves, but not as objectified. Others become, for lack of a better word, fellow world explorers. So Burke's description of being substantially one remains in some ways unsatisfying to me because of its lack of specificity about what this actually means and how it happens. My dissertation sets up a metaphor for identification through the visual imagery of the threshold fold, imagery that I largely pull from the works of Heidegger and Deleuze. So to summarize, I'm arguing that there exists a threshold between the subject-object, the inside-outside, and that the crossing of this threshold is an act of folding. And the fold is only made possible through a practicing of a form of a generative ethos, a term that I work to define through my chapters on style, the material, and place-based writing. So generative ethos creates, in some ways, disruptions in space-time, collapsing the threshold, and thus folding the subject-object. And so, in my mind, the fold is a more specific metaphor for Burke's concept of being substantially one. So the condition of the fold, however, cannot come to be until we are brought into a moment where we recognize the threshold or our essential separation, for identification cannot happen without division. To further understand the threshold, I want to reference the earlier idea of the call of language and return to Heidegger's example of the two presences, the here and now of the lecture hall and the winter evening described in the poem. The separation between these two locations and times is evident, yet there exists too the potential for a threshold to exist between them. Heidegger describes the threshold as, quote, the ground beam that bears the doorway as a whole. It sustains the middle in which the two, the outside and the inside, penetrate each other. The threshold bears the between. The threshold exists because multiple worlds and spaces and times also exist, often simultaneously. So our imaginations, because of the call of language, can access worlds, spaces, times beyond the one that we currently inhabit. The threshold then stands as a reminder of both literal separation and the potential for imaginative and sometimes literal crossings through the fold. As Heidegger continues, there is an, quote, intimacy of the world and things. Their difference is what appropriates them to one another. What unites opposites is the rift, the risk. That has become the difference, the pain of the threshold that joins. I think Heidegger's question about which presence is stronger, that of the literal reality or that of the language of the winter evening, is an acknowledgement as to how the threshold bridges two very present realities. To exist at the threshold is to be affected by both worlds at once. The threshold, though a helpful concept and one I build from here, does not, I think, complicate the experience of straddling the inside-outside. And thus I want to consider how a subject moves beyond the middle of the threshold. The fold is the move, for me, beyond the threshold, because it accounts for the relation of bodies, things, and people to each other. So Deleuze describes the fold as a figure that represents an infinite set of possibilities for relations of the inside-outside, just as we understand rhetorical identification as having many possibilities of occurring between a subject and object. Because the outside keeps changing, people, places, things, language, we can't help but be changed as well. The outside, Deleuze describes, cannot help but become the inside through a conversion of near to far, which, quote, constructs an inside space that will be completely co-present with the outside space at the line of the fold. So the fold as a concept reminds us all of those outside influences, all those thresholds that we have stood between and crossed. The fold can be seen as a type of topography that traces all the connections and differences between lived bodies, material objects, scientia, and the passions, finding them to be, in essence, a mesh of enfolded territories, according to Munster. The fold that shows us all these things are linked, and I think the thing that kind of links them or glues them together is rhetorical ethos. And so we kind of made our way back to rhetoric through the metaphor of the fold. Generative ethos is indeed the catalyst for folds because of the appeal's ability to widen our conceptions of space-time through its definition of gathering place and dwelling. When language, the material, and the environment affect us, and we experience the ethos appeal that speaks to us from the experience of living, whether our own or others, then we're drawn into folds and begin to create our own subjectivity. Deleuze asks important questions when he considers how the fold relates to character, when he writes, quote, what can I know or see and articulate? What can I do? What power can I claim? And what resistances may I counter? What can I be? With what folds can I surround myself? Or how can I produce myself as subject? The foldings we continue to make in our lives, the attempts to bring the outside in and project the inside out, are a way to understand character development. So subjectivity is a continual struggle, one in which we're always encountering difference and variation. Most importantly, when we consider the folds others make, we may feel substantially one or consubstantial with them, an affinity often created through recognizing how life experiences and attitudes of others align with our own. So, to get into some of the chapters and the case studies that I explore this theory through, in the second chapter, I'm doing a more traditional stylistic analysis of Jim Porter's writing. and this is actually from materials that I have of drafts and original things. It's a way, I think, to kind of connect when you see someone's handwriting. It's different than type. But in this chapter, I demonstrate that Quarter creates a discourse that enfolds its audience through his enactment of a personal performative style. And this writing is in the hope of creating an ethos that transcends living space and time. I talk about how Corderian rhetoric is an alternative to traditional argumentation because of its non-antagonistic stance and its open, inviting kind of language that Porter often employs when he's speaking to a reader. I talk about how unfolding an ethos to readers is a primary concept of Corderian rhetoric, and how readers often respond to his writings. Style is really one of the primary ways of enacting the unfolding of an ethos. And in this chapter, I do a stylistic analysis of a section of Porter's work, Notes on a Rhetoric of Regret, to talk more concretely about his creation of ethos through style. Specifically, I look at how he uses repetition, enumeration, and storytelling in his writing to achieve this creation of ethos. I explain how unfolding is accomplished through style and how the writer and reader can share space and time as created through the text. My next chapter takes us beyond the text into the material. And I think that through this chapter I'm really contributing to the growing fields of material rhetorics because I identify, define, and synthesize 6 material principles for readers and then apply them to an analysis of writings from materialists such as Jim Porter, Jane Bennett, Walter Benjamin, and Roland Barthes. So this heuristic that I've developed in many ways is trying to reconcile material scholarship that is based in rhetorical humanism, basically valuing the assignment of meaning to objects based on human activity and narrative. Oh, this is my grandmother's dress and it means this to me. And a more recent wave of scholarship, new materialism, that privileges the ontological and intrinsic meaning of objects themselves within a system of engagements. So objects, how they are there and kind of act with us as we move through space. So I see value in both ways of writing about and analyzing the material, and thus have tried to synthesize these approaches. And the synthesis, I think, is a step toward building a theory of rhetorical materiality that moves beyond a reactionary stance against subjectivity while being critical of the ways that agency functions in terms of the subject and our material engagements with objects. So the goal of this chapter is to really create an understanding of the material that is more spacious, one that accounts for a process of meaning-making across space and time, considering the give and take of the object and subject, the material and the organic. And so one motive for such an analysis can be to recognize instances of commonality in the ways we each interact with objects. And if we can see the things that matter to others and the reasons why they matter, this gives us a whole new way that we can identify with people. And when we understand that inhabiting the world is a process that others undertake through objects, we can begin to see others' values and their characters emerge. I gave this chapter as a job talk a couple times, and it was so amazing to me. People would come up and be like, when you said that thing about objects, I thought about this thing in my house and my grandmother and this, and I was like, I was really overwhelmed going into that chapter more and presenting it. And I think I'd love to do something further, actually interviewing people and making this more of an ethnographic, moving it more from a theoretical engagement with thinking about material objects to an ethnographic study. My next chapter is ethos as place-based. So in this 4th chapter, I talk about how practices of wandering really create our ability to dwell within places. And I consider movement's important role in our experience of place. I think often when we talk about place, it's disembodied, and I think that part of that disembodiment is because our field has relied a lot on the word topoi, which is rooted in very like discursive ways of thinking about topics, and argumentation. And the topoi as a term, it kind of just means here's that point on the map, here it is, here it is. But there's a more expansive way to think about place, and I've kind of looped that attached that meaning onto the Greek word hora, which and it has a lot of meanings, and I can't really like go through every single one right here and now, but it has a spatial meaning, it has an embodied meaning, and it has a discursive meaning. So it's a much larger and more expansive term to use, and in this chapter I'm arguing a shift in our lexicon, and when we talk about place. So I argue three main points in this chapter. First, that the continual process of getting into place, of wandering, is inextricably linked to rhetorical ethos. Second, that the non-discursive elements of place make their way to discourse through the revealing of place to us. So this is part of hora. Place often withdraws from us. We can't like express everything we love about a place or why it's so meaningful to us. So that withdrawal of place from us is really a part of hora, of that term hora. And thirdly, that the subject-object divisions between the self and the environment through this lens of wandering is a way to kind of fold place with us, how we feel identification with places. So I use Deleuze's concept of the fold to describe the ongoing synthesis between place and us. I introduce wandering as a rhetorical practice related to ethos, and I use Jim Porter's Lost in West Texas as a main frame for how wandering actually creates a relationship with place. I believe we have to continually wander because place is always withdrawing from us, so that wandering brings it nearer. I shift the discourse of the field to seeing place as hora rather than as topoi. I propose the term horophilia to describe our relationship or love with place. And I discuss how place becomes a part of us through the concept of the fold, both through embodied and mental wandering. I use Jim Porter's creative nonfiction writings as a case study to show this. In the last chapter, I talk about creating a pedagogical heuristic for place-based writing. I talk about how composition scholars have often used the idea of the flaneur, Benjamin's flaneur, in their writing on place, particularly like Nigel Reynolds and other people in geographies of place. Indeed, intimacy with place is often created through wandering, and Benjamin discusses this in the Arcades project, where the streets of Paris begin to feel like an extension of the bourgeois. However, there's also a sense that wandering, there's a potential to become lost and to even experience a sense of wonderment for place. So paying close attention to a familiar place through walking, through research, through photography and sketching, through reflective writing, has the potential to make what is familiar to us strange. And I think that it's this like wonderment in wandering that's an integral part of flannery that compositionists often miss in their talking about or deploying place-based pedagogies. And I think that it's arguably really essential for student invention when they're writing about place to do these sort of embodied activities. So after reading theory on place and creative nonfiction, students wrote their own reflections on a place. And they really became guides of their places, offering an insider perspective to a public audience. And fostering student invention was essential to this project as they conducted research on the place's history, walked through their places, and discovered a larger significance about their place that would interest a public audience. So students also reflected, too, on how their place was an integral part of their character development and how their interactions with this place in some ways created a fold between the subject-object. So the chapter provides a practical heuristic for teaching students how to write about plays, particularly through acts of wandering. And the heuristic challenges students to consider the emotional life of their plays, its transformation over time, and its, in some ways, mythical and fantastical elements that we can attach to our significance in thinking about places. So this dissertation answers a call in some ways to breathe new life into classical rhetorical concepts through its exploration of ethos in relation to acts of rhetorical identification. So rather than seeing ethos as only tied to language that is written and spoken, we should adopt a more abstract view of language as Heidegger describes, one that accounts for our engagements, including acts of wandering and imagining, with our places and our material things. The rhetoricians need to return to thinking of ethos as an appeal that relates to our practices of dwelling. Ethos is all at once and, quote, at the very least, of character, ethics, being, space and time, emotion, truth, rhetorical competence in everyday situations, according to Michael Hyde. And as an appeal, it allows us to experience, quote, a metaphysical wonder as we explore our environments and live in them with others. Ethos is at once textual and beyond textual. Ethos is generative as we continue to create and discover the origins of our characters, and because of this inventive quality, ethos is the appeal that holds open space-time and invites another into how we understand our being. As such, ethos can be thought of as a catalyst for creating a threshold between the self and other, whether human or material, that collapses space-time as we traditionally understand it. These thresholds, these disruptions, are what I see as the heart of creating rhetorical identifications. The crossings of thresholds, the foldings of the subject-object, teach us ways of being with others. Jim Porter's words continue to resonate with me as my work explores how to, quote, speak a commodious language, creating a world full of space and time that will hold our diversities. And I just want to continue to explain what this looks like and what this means for our ways of identifying with each other. Well, thank you. I guess this is the
Well,
question.
we have time for, let's say, 3 questions or.
Listening to you talking about the sort of way that we need to reconceive of ethos, in particular talking about it of getting it away from the moment of topoi, I'm wondering if you could talk about I'm guessing your own struggle of getting away from that word, because it's something we're so embedded in. I guess what was the first sort of moment maybe in your work here that you realized, like, topoi's not going to do it?
I don't know.
Knowing that it might be a series of moments.
Yeah. I think I came through that just by reading more and more. I returned to Gregory Ulmer's work for a little bit, and I don't really cite him much in the dissertation, but and I was thinking about how multimodal composing and how topoi in some ways becomes like less relevant when we're not composing within writing. And I was teaching multimodal composing, and then I was like, wow, this term chora is really interesting to me when I encountered Ulmer's work, and then I read Derrida's work on chora, and that really exploded it for me. I think I had a conversation with Ken about that once, and then I was like, oh, this is a really good frame for this chapter, because like quarter, I think wandering can't be done in a linear fashion. Topoi is destroyed in that framework, or thinking about place in that way. I can't think about it in that traditional way. It has to be recursive, and it has to be a term that's messier. So that's kind of, I think, how the shift happened. I don't know. It's like I'm always surprised sometimes by like how turns that happen, because like I didn't plan that, and then it just happened. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Then I was really interested in your place-based pedagogy ideas, and I'd like to hear a little bit more. I know you had to kind of briefly give us the overview, but and maybe this is something you can share with each other later. But I'd love to hear more about what that looks like kind of on the ground.
Right, and so in the chapter, I also I couldn't reproduce this, but I analyzed like some student work that came out of that unit. But I do a lot of stuff that I do is mapping. So I've done a lot where I have students read, for example, Late Word from the Provinces, which is a article by Porter where he maps out his province in West Texas with like landmarks and different things, and gives us directions to where he's from. And that idea of giving directions, of assigning landmarks is really like, I find that really interesting. So I created a lesson based off that where students had to read that article, and then we did an invention activity where they had to come up with landmarks that they would consider part of their province. We talked about like, what does it mean to be provincial? Is that like, that's my earring. It's not like, I never wear earrings. Everyone's like, oh my god, Rosanne owns a dress. Yeah, so, yes. So, like, then thinking about the idea of province, like, bringing them into that, and then let's walk through that province. If you, like, a lot of them who had access to it, they were able, I made them, like, go and do it. But, like, either that they had to do it, like, mentally, like, because some of them were writing about places that they hadn't interacted with in years, so, but, usually I had people, they had to pick places that they were very, very, very familiar with to do this assignment. It wasn't like, oh, I went to Italy 1 year and it's an amazing place. Like, no, you have to, like, when I taught it, it would have to be like, you know, your hometown or some place that you were like really familiar with. I probably didn't answer the question, but really well. But I could talk more about it with you.
It was just kind of wanting to get a more visual idea of what you did.
Could be a follow-up on that. I'm wondering, did you have students who did things like, I've walked around my hometown on like Google Maps and things like that. I've used these new mapping technologies, and I wondered if students had done anything like that.
You know, I didn't bridge that, but I actually just gave a panel about this at SEAS, and Ashley Holmes was on my panel, and she was talking about like multimodal, like composing and mapping, and I was like, oh, I didn't think about. I just had them draw a map. We drew a map. It was like 1950 in my class. I don't know, you know. So I didn't really like think about that, but I like if I retaught this, I probably would. Actually, I really want to redo this chapter, like not redo it, but like reimagine it, teach the assignment again, and do it in some different ways, and like revise this chapter eventually for the book project. Yeah.
I was really interested about your one of your chapters where you talk about materiality, and we talked about this in like gleeful nerdiness about books.
Yeah.
And so you were saying that you're going to do an ethnographic study with individuals who have a connection to items in place.
Yeah.
Where do you exactly see that going?
Sorry.
I said, where do you actually see that project going? Like, what do you anticipate with the ethnographic study?
I just want to see if like the frame that I set up for investigating the material, if people like bring up things that, like so some of the principles that I have is like are like narrative, how narrative bridges meaning for objects, and so if people tell narratives about their object, like that would check, like yay, got that one right. No. Or like even thinking about how objects change meaning for people over time. So one of my principles is becoming, and how an object can become something different for someone as they continue to encounter it. So if the narrative keeps changing, that would be a principle that I thought of theoretically, but is shown in the work. So I mean, this this chapter, I think it was about like 50 pages, just like of theory, but I'd like to bridge it to, and I do bridge it to stories that were published. So I look at, for example, Roland Barthes' camera lucida. People who are familiar with that work. He talks a lot about this photograph of his mother in that monograph. And I talk a lot about how he related to that photograph and his like understanding of materiality through it. So I have like 4 case studies in that chapter based on people writing about material objects, but nothing worth like live people today. So.
One thing I find interesting too, especially this connection to material objects, is also the use of imagination,
Right.
and then not just narratives and what people construct as
Right.
what is real, but what they imagine
Right.
from the past and what will be for the future.
Right. I talk a lot about that idea of like like clairvoyancy and sort of the idea of like seeing through objects. Benjamin talks a lot about that in his writing about materiality in both the Arcades project and unpacking my library. So I use a lot of his work to kind of talk about that, I guess, that the being taken out of the here and now through material objects. I talk a lot about Kairos in my dissertation. Like sad that I didn't like. I was like, I gotta cut the Kairos. I gotta cut it. But there's a lot in my dissertation on Kairos, and that's one of the things that I talk about.
This should probably conclude the public presentation. Thank you all so much for coming to listen to Rosanne's exciting research.
Thank you guys. And on the way out, can you just grab all the food? Take all the food. I was gonna say that you should eat during presentation, and I forgot. So I
Turn on my face. Oh, hi, Rosanne. Okay, we're gonna end this now.